It's great to welcome to the program today Adam Frank, who's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester, also author of the book Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth. Adam, so great to have you on today.
Real pleasure.
So just to begin with, if we want to broadly start thinking about the idea of life in the universe outside of Earth, there are those who make sort of mathematical, probabilistic arguments. If you consider the size of the universe, it's mathematically likely that there is life elsewhere. There are others who make arguments sort of along different lines. What is the best filter or frame through which you think is most useful to think about that question of life elsewhere in the universe?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, the probabilistic arguments still are the best, especially given the what I like to call the exoplanet revolution of the last 20 years or so. So, when people started thinking about this via the Drake equation, that's really where the probabilistic arguments came from. In 1960, we really didn't know much about what was out there in terms of just the baseline for where life could form. And now we know that every star in the sky pretty much has planets. So we did a paper a few years ago that used the empirical data to set kind of a baseline on how this one way of framing it is how unlikely would it have to be for us to be the only civilization in the universe. And it turns out to be 1 in 10 billion trillion. Like the odds per habitable planet would have to be less than 1 in 10 billion trillion in order for us to be the only time it's happened. That number is so low that you're really beginning to stretch the bounds of credibility. So, we know now that there's so many planets, so many places for life to form, that I think that way of understanding it is the right way of sort of getting a handle on at least whether or not civilizations have happened before. It doesn't mean there's anybody around now, but whether or not, we're a one-off.
So how different are the questions of, is there life elsewhere in the universe versus is there currently what we would call intelligent life elsewhere in the universe? Because those might sound like similar questions, but mathematically they might be drastically different.
Yeah, that's a great point. In fact, they could be enormously different. If you look at the history of the Earth, for example, microbial life seems to have appeared very rapidly after the Earth formed, 4 billion years ago or so. And it took intelligence. Intelligence, literally only happened yesterday. So if you just look at that, it seems like you can use that argument to say, look, microbial life, basic life is going to be very easy to form, but getting intelligence may require a lot more accidents, so to speak, to happen. You got to pile them on, So I think it's reasonable to separate those out. But when it comes to finding life, it may be that it may be easier to find signatures of technological civilizations than it is finding, evidence on distant planets of just microbial life.
When we think about the idea of intelligent life now versus at some point in the past, which you alluded to, let's dig into that a little bit. There's this concept of some kind of possible filter, which
Right.
might explain why we have not heard from other intelligent forms of life. And that may be that once life gets to a certain level of intelligence, something happens that destroys it. It could be self-destruction. It could be something else. Can you talk a little bit about that concept and how it should sort of inform our analysis of this?
Sure. That's what's called the great filter. But if you don't mind, if we just step back a little bit,
Yep.
because there is this question people have like, oh, we've been looking for so long and we haven't seen anything. That is sometimes called the great silence. And it turns out that's not true. I mean, what people have to understand about the search for extraterrestrial intelligence is that really NASA or anybody else has never funded a very detailed search. So recently there was a paper that was done where basically a couple of astronomers looked at how much of the sky we've looked at. And so if the sky was like the ocean, we have only searched right now through a hot tub. So, if you looked at a hot tub and didn't find any dolphins, you wouldn't say, oh, the ocean doesn't have any dolphins in it. So that's something that's very important to know, is that we haven't looked very hard. So we don't know. But the great filter argument is the possibility that, or posits that, yeah, there's something that either keeps intelligent civilizations from forming or they don't last long, right? Because if every civilizations could be popping up all the time, but if they all last 200 years, which may be how long we last, then, there's not going to be many out there to talk to. So the great filter could be in our past. It could be that it's very hard to form intelligence, for example, and somehow we got through, hooray. Or the great filter could be climate change. It could be that everybody triggers climate change, and very few civilizations are smart enough to get through it. So most of them end with their climate change period. So the great filter could be hiding like a snake in our future, or it's in the past and we got lucky.
That's interesting. So let's talk about climate change a little bit. The idea would be that dealing with climate change, that intelligent life inevitably starts to modify their environment in such a way that it will ultimately, potentially at least, cause the self-destruction of that environment, of that civilization. This is merely speculative at this point, or how much has that concept caught on in the context of great filter discussions?
Well, this is the work that I and my colleagues have been doing. And, we've been arguing that it's really hard not to trigger climate change. What is a civilization? What do we mean from a scientific point about what a civilization is? It's basically a species that has become very successful at harvesting energy from their planet. Now, we now know enough about planets from studying Earth's history, from Mars, Venus, the moon Titan around Saturn, that we understand climate really well. And if you're going to harvest a huge amount of energy to do work, which is what civilization is, you're going to have a feedback on your planet. It's going to be hard not to have a feedback on a planet. So, first of all, this totally changes how we look at climate change, right? The question now is no longer, did we change the climate? Instead, it's like, duh, what did you expect to happen? You built a giant civilization. So then the next question is, does this always happen? And I think the argument, we've been running models. We've been, starting off with simplified models of planets and civilizations, very generic. And what we find is that you always trigger climate change. It's hard not to feedback on your planet. And then the question is, who gets through, right? What does it take to get you through this period and come to a new equilibrium with your planet? And that's very much an open question. We did find, luckily, that some of the models led to a new steady state, change climate, but the whole, your civilization doesn't die off. But also many of the models showed collapse as well. So, there's a lot more work to be done on this. But I think the answer is that pretty much every technological civilization triggers climate change, and some will get through and many won't.
So there's the movement that is the search for extraterrestrial life and or intelligence. There's a movement that is a sort of space exploration movement for the preservation of Homo sapiens. The idea that eventually it could be because of climate change in 50 years. It could be because the sun expands and engulfs the Earth in much longer than that. But eventually there will need to be some other place for Homo sapiens if the species is to persist. There is the idea of exploring space for the benefit of technological development to be used here on Earth. There's all these different areas.
Right.
Question one, do these interact with each other in substantively meaningful ways, or are they relatively siloed endeavors and priorities? And number two, what's your more general sense of what the relationship should be of humans to space exploration right now and sort of over the next 10 to 20 years?
Those are great questions. Well, for your first one about the siloing, they were siloed. But what's remarkable is that with climate change, they can't be siloed anymore, right? Climate change, we think of climate change in terms of this, we're running around like a chicken with our heads cut off. Half the country doesn't even think it's happening. The other half is terrified. And I think what we have to understand is that climate change is actually a profound transformation. It's a moment. It's like adolescence, right? When you become an adolescent, you've now gained enough power over yourself that you can have the keys to a car. We now have the keys to a planet. We never would have learned about this unless we were doing space exploration, right? We only really figured out climate change because we were looking at the Earth from orbit. Or we were looking at other planets. Understanding Mars and Venus were instrumental to our understanding climate change. So, space exploration are becoming a spacefaring race. are becoming triggering climate change and are recognizing climate change all fit together. And I think that's going to be true of any civilization. So we now have to recognize that all of these things are happening at the same time because they're supposed to happen at the same time. You trigger climate change, when you become a spacefaring race, because that's when you have the industrial capability, and you don't get to know that you triggered climate change unless you're a spacefaring race. And then hopefully you learn what to do with it. So one thing also I want to point out, though, there is no planet B. Like, there's no way that we're going to get to Mars. We're going to be able to offload to Mars to deal with climate change. We have to deal with climate change here on Earth. But here's it for your second question. I think that what is important is that we are just about to become truly a spacefaring race. Like, the last 50 years, we've taken our first tentative steps. And now with the new space movement, as you're pointing out, with Elon Musk and the commercial utilization of space, we are poised to begin settling the solar system. And I'm a big fan of this for many reasons, but mainly it's because, in some sense, the next 1,000 years or so of human history, if we make it through climate change, is going to be the settlement of the solar system, because the stars are too far away. Barring a technological miracle, the solar system is really where the next 1,000 years of our history gets played out. So if we can get through climate change and we can, manage to understand how to have a thriving ecosystem on Earth, we're going to learn enough to start building artificial ecosystems, large artificial ecosystems elsewhere in the solar system. So it's all very tightly coupled together for me.
When we think about policy between countries, between nation states with regard to space, it's sort of a Wild West right now. I mean, you've got I believe it's the Moon Treaty from the 70s, and there's one piece of legislation that I think is more recent. But how soon do you think that the lack of legal infrastructure in space will become relevant based on what it is that's planned over the next 10, 20, 30 years?
Yeah, we're already in trouble.
Okay.
We're already at the end of those treaties. Very quickly, we're going to need to start rethinking this. Because, if you want to have a thriving space economy, I am all for the, economic using space, not just exploration, but beginning to start thinking about it in terms of commercial activity, because nobody's going there unless there's money to be made, right? And that's how you'll start building thriving, new, interesting communities, people trying all different kinds of experiments in democracy and other good things, in these settlements. So you have to be able to ensure both the commercial viability. People have to be able to invest and have a return on their investment. But also, at the same time, you've also got to make sure that all of space is open for everybody. You don't want to have like two corporations battling it out for the ownership of space. So there's a lot of very tricky legal precedents that we're going to have to establish over the next few years. And right now, as you said, it's a Wild West. So people need to really understand that space is not just for, heroic astronauts anymore. Very soon it's going to be for working people and investors and explorers. So, yeah, we're right on the lip of that.
I don't doubt that. At the same time, what scares me is I have this idea, and maybe it's an incredibly naive and idealistic thing, that progress in space would be an extremely sort of uniting process for humans on Earth, that the imaginary borders between countries would become far less relevant as we start to become a spacefaring race. And I mean, imagine for a second if we were to encounter intelligent life elsewhere. Where I get scared is I feel as though it being hyper commercialized from the beginning will basically just transfer all the same problems we're already dealing with here to space, and it will sort of counteract that possible uniting force. Is that a concern that you share, or am I maybe missing something?
No, I think that's a good concern. That's why these treaties have to balance. We have to learn from our mistakes in our various periods of colonization over the last 10,000 years. We have to learn from our mistakes in the past about how to explore, because that's what we do. Human beings are always going over the next hill looking for a better deal. So how to both have that need to expand, but also do it sensibly and do it with some kind of compassion, both for the environments that we're touching, even if they're not living, as well as ourselves. So, my hope is that, that is going to be possible. So, but that's going to be very tricky. But again, that's why this is so tied to climate change. Like, in many ways, we're going to have to reorganize ourselves on a pretty deep level in order to get through climate change as well. So all of this stuff is happening at the same time, and all of it poses the possibility. Either you can go down the same road, and make the same mistakes, or you have these possibilities of really reconfiguring the way you do civilization in ways that will be more free, more compassionate, and allow life of all kinds to thrive.
Make sure you check out the book Light of the Stars, Alien Worlds and the Fate of the Earth. We've been speaking, of course, with the book's author, Adam Frank, who's a professor of astrophysics at the University of Rochester. Adam, really a pleasure having you today.
It was really fun talking. Thank you.